The year was 1886, and the wind in the Colorado Territory was a living thing. It was not a gentle breeze that whispered through grasses, but a raw, elemental force that scoured the land, peeled paint from clapboard, and drove sand into the very marrow of a person's bones. It had a voice, a high, lonely keen that was the constant soundtrack to life on the high plains, a sound that promised brutal winters and parched summers. In this dominion of wind, Elara Finch was engaged in an act of quiet, methodical madness. For 3 years, since her husband Thomas had succumbed to a fever that burned through him as quickly as a prairie fire, she had been planting trees. Not a few saplings for shade or a small orchard for fruit, but a forest in miniature, a dense and carefully designed perimeter around the small, sturdy cabin Thomas had built with his own hands. Her neighbors, the few souls scattered across the vast rolling expanse, watched her work with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They saw a woman alone, with 2 small children, Samuel and Lily, spending her precious energy not on reinforcing the sod banking of her home or expanding her vegetable patch, but on digging endless holes in the hard, unforgiving earth. She would disappear for days at a time with her mule and cart, returning not with supplies from the distant town, but with the cart laden with spindly saplings, their roots carefully wrapped in damp burlap. They saw her hauling water, bucket by agonizing bucket, from the creek a quarter-mile away, her shoulders stooped under the yoke to give each fragile transplant a fighting chance. They saw a widow, lost in her grief, performing a strange and futile ritual against the immutable power of the plains. Amos Kelleher, a man whose opinions were as hard and unyielding as the winter ground, made his assessment known to anyone who would listen. He was a practical man, a man who believed in stone, sod, and thick timber, things that had tangible weight and proven worth. "It's a fool's errand," he declared one afternoon, watching Elara from the seat of his wagon as she painstakingly set a young pine into the ground. "The wind'll tear 'em to shreds before the first snow. If the wind don't get 'em, the lack of water will. She's planting sticks, nothing more. Ought to be spending her time putting up a proper stone wall on the north face, like any sensible person would." His wife, Dora, would nod in agreement, her expression a mask of sorrowful condescension. "Poor Elara," she'd murmur at the small gatherings in their parlor. "Her mind must have gone with him, toiling like that for nothing. Her children will suffer for it." The chorus of skepticism was a constant, low hum in the background of Elara's life. It came in the form of well-meaning advice to abandon her project, in the pitying glances she received when she brought her meager goods to the trading post, and in the way the other women would fall silent when she approached. They saw her planting trees. They did not see the intricate geometry of her design. They saw a woman wasting effort. They did not understand the principle she was enacting. They saw folly because watching an outcome is not the same as understanding the principle. Amusement was a safer position than inquiry, and pity a more comfortable emotion than the unsettling prospect of witnessing something they could not comprehend. Only Constance Hartwell, herself a widow who understood the particular solitude of a woman's work, watched with a quiet, non-judgmental eye. She offered no advice and no pity, only a steady gaze that seemed to acknowledge the sheer, stubborn will of Elara's labor, even if she, too, could not fathom its purpose. Elara heard the whispers, and she saw the looks. She felt the weight of their collective certainty that she was wrong. But it was a distant pressure, like a storm happening on the other side of a mountain range. Her own certainty was rooted deeper than their opinions, in a place they could not access. It came from her father, a quiet man who had been a naturalist in the East, a man more comfortable with the language of trees and river systems than with the chatter of men. He had never seen the vast, wind-torn plains where she now lived, but he had taught her to see the world not as a collection of objects, but as a series of interconnected systems. He had taught her that you do not fight a force like the wind, you persuade it. You do not build a wall to stop it, for it will only break itself against the wall in fury. Instead, you build a ramp to guide it, a series of obstacles that diffuse its power, lift its energy, and create a pocket of calm in its lee. She remembered walking with him through a dense forest after a great storm. Outside the woods, great oaks lay toppled, their roots torn from the earth. But inside the forest's edge, the damage was minimal. "See, Elara," he had said, his voice soft. "The edge of the forest takes the first blow. The shrubs and the low branches, they don't try to stand firm. They bend. They break the wind into 1,000 smaller currents. By the time the wind reaches the tall trees in the center, its strength is spent. It's a system. Each part has its purpose." Thomas, her practical and beloved husband, had understood strength in terms of thickness and weight. He had built their cabin to withstand a direct assault. But her father had taught her a different kind of strength, the strength of resilience, of cooperation, of clever design. What her neighbors saw as a fence of twigs was, in her mind, the carefully layered edge of a burgeoning forest. The principle was one of aerodynamic diffusion, a concept for which she had no name but a profound intuitive understanding. Her outer layer, the one facing the prevailing northwesterly winds, was composed of the hardiest, most flexible shrubs she could find: wild plum, chokecherry, and resilient Russian olive saplings she had traded for. They were low to the ground, designed to take the first brutal impact of the wind, to trip it and begin its upward deflection. Behind this rugged front line, she planted a staggered, denser row of faster-growing, deciduous trees like cottonwood and willow, harvested as cuttings from the creek bank. Their purpose was to act as the main body of the ramp, to absorb the wind's momentum and lift the main current of air higher. Finally, in the innermost circle, closest to the cabin, she planted the evergreens, ponderosa pine and blue spruce, carried down from the foothills with immense effort. These were the heart of her fortress. Their dense, year-round needles would be the final barrier, creating the pocket of still, quiet air that was her ultimate goal. She had tried to explain it once, to Amos Kelleher, on a day when his skepticism had been particularly loud and public. He had found her reinforcing a small stone well around the base of a young spruce. "Still at it, Elara," he'd said, his tone heavy with disapproval. "That tree'll be dead by Christmas." She had straightened up, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove. "It's not about one tree, Mr. Kelleher," she had replied, her voice even. "It's about all of them together. The outer rows will lift the wind up over the top of the pines. It will create a calm space here, by the house." Amos had stared at her, then let out a short, barking laugh. "Lift the wind? Woman, you can't tell the wind where to go. It's wind. It blows where it wills. You might as well try to damn the sky." He had shaken his head, climbed back onto his wagon, and driven away, leaving her in a cloud of dust and derision. After that, she stopped trying to explain. The work would be its own explanation, in time. The labor was immense, a testament to the singular focus that grief can sometimes provide. It became the rhythm of her life, a physical expression of her will to survive, to protect her children. The first year was a battle for every single sapling. She rose before dawn each day, the yoke on her shoulders a familiar weight, and began the long walk to the creek. The water she carried was a lifeline, each drop precious. She learned the language of the soil, the subtle shifts in color that indicated clay or sand, the places where the ground held moisture a little longer. She used rocks not just to anchor the saplings, but to create small basins that would catch and hold the infrequent rain, shading the soil beneath them and slowing evaporation. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong, the lines on her palms filled with the dirt of her unending project. The second year, a small miracle occurred. The outer shrubs, the tough and scrubby vanguard, began to take hold. They were no longer fragile twigs, but dense, intertwined bushes, their roots sinking deep to find the hidden moisture. The willows and cottonwoods behind them shot upward with surprising speed, their thin, silvery leaves shimmering in the sun. They were not yet a wall, but they were a presence, a line drawn against the vast emptiness of the prairie. That summer, she noticed the first tangible effect. The fine, sandy soil on the north side of her cabin, which had always blown away in dusty sheets, began to stay put, trapped by the nascent root systems of her shrubs. It was a small victory, invisible to anyone but her, but it fueled her resolve. She expanded the grove, planting another layer on the eastern flank to protect against the shearing winds that sometimes came down from the mountains. By the end of the third year, the transformation was undeniable, though her neighbors still called it Finch's folly. The shrubs were now a thick, tangled hedge, nearly as tall as she was. The deciduous trees behind them formed a flickering screen of green that rose well above the cabin's roofline, and nestled within, the young evergreens were beginning to fill out, their dark, sturdy forms a promise of the permanent sanctuary to come. The sound of the wind had begun to change. It no longer shrieked directly against her window panes. Instead, she heard it rushing and roaring over the house, a sound more like a distant river than a direct assault. The air inside the grove was different. On a blustery day, she could walk among her trees and feel only a gentle stirring of the air, while just a few dozen yards away, the prairie grasses were bent flat against the ground. The children, Samuel and Lily, made it their private world, a magical woodland in the middle of the empty plains, where they were sheltered from the relentless sun and the constant wearing wind. The work was a meditation. As she dug and watered and pruned, her mind would drift to Thomas, to the life they had planned. He had wanted to build a great barn, to raise cattle, to conquer this land with strength and size. His vision had been one of dominion. Hers was becoming one of partnership. She wasn't conquering the wind, she was placating it, giving it a path of lesser resistance that happened to lead up and over her home. She learned the character of each species she planted, the stubborn resilience of the junipers, the thirsty ambition of the cottonwoods, the slow, patient strength of the pines. They were not just materials, they were allies in her quiet war for survival. She felt a kinship with them, these living things she had brought to a place they were not supposed to be, coaxing them to create a world where they, and she, could thrive. In the autumn of the fourth year, the whispers from the high country began. Trappers and surveyors coming down from the mountains spoke of an early, unusually heavy snowfall. The Ute elders, who read the signs in the migration of birds and the thickness of animal pelts, were predicting a winter of unparalleled severity, a winter that would test the very limits of life on the plains. The air grew colder, the sky a hard, metallic gray. The wind picked up, a constant, knife-edged gale from the northwest that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods and sent tumbleweeds racing across the prairie like panicked animals. Amos Kelleher and the other homesteaders worked frantically, banking their homes with thick walls of sod and manure, piling hay against their barn doors, and bringing their livestock into close, cramped shelters. They looked over at Elara's cabin, nestled in its strange little forest, and shook their heads. Those flimsy trees, they thought, would offer no real protection against what was coming. Elara prepared with a calm that her neighbors mistook for ignorance. Her preparations were different from theirs. She did not build new walls of sod. Her walls were alive and already in place. She spent her days securing the small animal shelter that stood in the lee of the densest pine cluster. She checked the seals on her windows and the chinking between the logs of her cabin. She laid in her stores of firewood in the woodshed, which was now so protected that not a whisper of wind touched it. She felt the change in the air pressure, a deep, heavy stillness that was the harbinger of the storm. She watched as the first snowflakes, small and hard as pellets of sand, began to skitter across the frozen ground. The children, sensing the gravity of the moment, stayed close, their play hushed and watchful. Elara drew them in, her confidence a warm blanket against the growing cold. She had faith in her process. The theory was sound. The labor was done. Now came the crucible. The blizzard did not arrive. It descended. It was as if the gray sky simply collapsed, loosing a fury of wind and snow that erased the world. The sun vanished. The horizon disappeared. There was only a roaring, swirling whiteness, a chaos of blinding snow, and a wind that sounded like a freight train passing an inch from the ear. Inside their homes, the other settlers felt the storm as a physical assault. The wind found every crack, driving icy powder into their rooms. The walls shuddered under the constant, punishing pressure. The very timbers of their cabins groaned in protest. Amos Kelleher sat by his stove, feeding it log after log, feeling the cold radiate from the north wall of his house as if it were made of ice. He could hear the shriek of the wind as it tried to tear the shingles from his roof, and he worried about the massive drift that would even now be burying his barn. Inside Elara's cabin, the world was utterly different. The silence was the first thing she noticed. It was not a true silence, but a deep, muffled quiet. The terrifying, high-pitched scream of the wind was gone. In its place was a profound, low-frequency roar that seemed to be happening far away, high above them. The house did not shudder. The windows did not rattle. The fine, driven snow did not snake in under the door. She went to the north-facing window and peered out. She could see nothing but the thick trunks of her inner ring of pine trees, standing like silent sentinels just a few feet away. Snow was piling up against them, but it was a soft, mounded accumulation, not the hard-packed, sculpted drift of a wind-blasted landscape. The wind was being forced up and over, just as her father had said it would. It was expending its fury on the treetops, a battle happening 50 feet above their heads, leaving their small pocket of the world in an almost supernatural calm. For 2 days and 2 nights, the blizzard raged. Elara kept a low, steady fire in the hearth, more for cheer than for desperate warmth. The cabin held its heat in a way it never had before. The lack of wind against the logs meant the cold did not leach through. They had food, they had warmth, and they had a profound and peaceful quiet. Samuel and Lily, who had been terrified during previous, lesser storms, were calm. They read books by the firelight, played with their carved wooden toys, and slept soundly through the nights, untroubled by the elemental war being waged just beyond their sanctuary. Elara would occasionally stand by the door and just listen, her eyes closed, separating the sounds. She could hear the deep, resonant whoomph as loads of snow fell from the overloaded pine branches. She could hear the great, distant roar of the main storm. But she could not hear the wind's direct voice. She had taken its voice away, at least in this one small place. On the morning of the third day, the roaring subsided. A strange, bright, colorless light filled the cabin. Elara opened the door and stepped out into a transformed world. She was not met with a wall of snow, as she had been so many times before. A gentle slope of powder lay a few feet from her door. But it was no obstacle. She walked forward into the heart of her grove. The air was bitingly cold, but utterly still. All around her, the trees were laden with a thick, impossibly heavy blanket of snow. Above, the sky was a brilliant, painful blue. And then she saw the proof of her victory. She walked to the western edge of her trees and looked out. Just beyond the last row of shrubs, a monstrous snowdrift, sculpted by the furious wind, rose in a sharp, graceful curve. It was taller than her cabin, a solid wall of snow packed as hard as ice. It marked the line where the wind, tripped and lifted by her trees, had finally been forced to drop its heavy burden. Her grove had acted like a snow fence on a massive scale, creating the drift yards away from her home, protecting the space within. The sensory proof was overwhelming. It was the silence, the stillness of the air on her skin, the sight of the smoke from her chimney rising in a perfectly straight, gray column against the blue sky. It was the feeling of safety, a deep, bone-felt security that was the direct result of her 4 years of back-breaking, solitary labor. She looked at the massive drift that marked the edge of her sanctuary and thought of Amos Kelleher. His house, his barn, his entire homestead would be buried under a mountain of it. The wind had not been stopped. It had been guided. The principle was true. She felt a quiet, profound triumph that needed no audience. It was a conversation between her, the land, and the memory of her father. She had listened, she had understood, and she had built, not with brute force, but with knowledge. Later that day, she saw movement on the vast white expanse to the east. It was a figure, struggling through the deep snow, moving with the slow, exhausted gait of a man who had been fighting a losing battle. It was Amos Kelleher. He was not heading for his own barn, which she could see was half buried, but for her cabin. He carried a shovel, but it seemed more a burden than a tool. He floundered through the deep snow of the open prairie, sinking to his waist with every step. Then he reached the edge of her grove, the place where the great drift began. He paused, leaning on his shovel, and stared. He was looking at the impossible, a small island of calm in a sea of frozen chaos. He finally pushed through the lower edge of the drift and entered the sheltered space of the trees. The change was immediate. He straightened up, no longer needing to lean into a wind that wasn't there. He took a few more steps, his boots sinking into soft, unpacked powder instead of fighting through the wind-hardened crust. He looked at her cabin, at the clear path to her door, at the smoke rising straight to heaven. He looked at her children, who were now outside, laughing as they built a small fort out of the soft snow. He walked slowly toward her, his face a mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and a dawning, reluctant respect. He stopped a few feet from where she stood on her porch, the shovel hanging limply from his hand. He looked at the trees, then at her. He opened his mouth, but for a long moment, no words came out. He was a man accustomed to being right, a man whose worldview was built on a foundation of proven, practical methods. That foundation had just been shattered. "Elara," he finally said, his voice rough with fatigue and something else, humility. My barn. The north door is buried under 10 feet of snow. The stock can't get out. I can't get in." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the serene, protected space around her home. "Your trees," he said, the words plain and heavy with the weight of his admission. "They worked. I never would have believed it." It was not an apology, not in the conventional sense, but it was a complete and total capitulation. It was the acknowledgement of a truth he had mocked, a truth that was now staring him plainly in the face. Elara simply nodded. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of, "I told you so." That was not her way. "I have a stew on the stove, Amos," she said quietly. "Come inside, warm yourself. Then I'll help you dig." That winter, the story of Finch's folly began to change. When other homesteaders finally dug themselves out, they saw the stark contrast between Elara's oasis and their own wind-battered homes. They came first out of curiosity, then out of necessity. They saw the science of it, written in the patterns of the snow and the stillness of the air. That spring, Amos Kelleher was the first to come to her, hat in hand, not with advice, but with a question. "Mrs. Finch," he'd asked, "what kind of trees did you say you planted in that outer row?" She shared her knowledge as freely as she had shared her stew. She explained the principle of layers, of diffusion, of guiding the wind instead of fighting it. She showed them how to harvest willow cuttings from the creek and how to identify the hardiest shrubs. She explained why the evergreens had to be on the inside, protected until they were strong enough to form the final barrier. They listened this time. They listened with the focus of people who had survived a terrible winter and did not wish to repeat the experience. That year, the digging on the plains was different. It was not for sod or for stone, but for the planting of trees. Men who had once mocked her now followed her guidance, their own hands planting the saplings that would, in time, become their own fortresses against the wind. Finch's Folly became known as Finch's Grove, and then simply the Grove. It grew and thickened over the years, becoming a lush, dark green island in the pale sea of prairie grass, visible for miles. It became a landmark for travelers, a place of shelter for herds of deer, and a haven for songbirds that had never before lingered in that windy place. Elara's children grew up within its protection, their childhoods defined by the whisper of pine needles rather than the howl of the wind. The methods she had pioneered, born from her father's quiet wisdom and her own unyielding labor, became the standard practice for homesteaders across the territory. The sight of a cabin without its layered shelter belt of trees eventually became a rarity, a sign of a newcomer who had not yet learned the hard-won lessons of the land. Elara Finch lived a long life in the calm heart of her creation, a quiet innovator who had listened to the wind, understood its nature, and taught it a new path, leaving behind a legacy not of stone or iron, but of living, breathing sanctuaries that grew stronger with every passing season.